my voice.
So the way I got started was a friend of mine in Long Island, Ray Merritt, he said, you ought to start writing down some of your stories, little anecdotes. So then another friend, Eric Fischel, gave me a book about autobiographies. And I read the preface. And it stated that all autobiographies share two characteristics. They're chronological and they're anecdotal. And that's as far as I got in the book. So it's interesting that I started writing my earliest recollections. And I've done a lot of books and I lay them out on the computer. And I had a 2-page spread left over from a previous title I had done. And so I just started typing in my stories. I just imported a text box and I just started typing. Or if I was somewhere else at the beach or something, I would, got an idea, I would type it on my iPhone and send myself an email. And I would cut and paste that. And I just started bringing in text. And what happened was that I quickly got to a certain point, but as you will see, my wrenching childhood, there's some trauma involved. And I was probably 77, 76 when I started it. And so I decided to talk to a shrink for the first time in my life. And I found that there were more memories available than I had previously thought. And I was able to evoke these, but curiously enough, not as many of them wound up in the final book. You know, I had this version of the book after, I wrote the whole thing in less than a year. And I only worked on it when I felt like it. Only if I was in the mood. I'd go to my studio, which I go to every day, and if I didn't have anything to say, I wouldn't force myself to sit in front of the word processor. I just did it when I felt like it. But, you know, all of a sudden I would bring in pictures and I'd get ideas, and there's a lot of profiles of my friends in this book. Some of them are here tonight. And I said little things about people. I put in whatever I wanted, but I will tell you, there's a word that I became familiar with in the process called hagiographic, which is basically you're only putting in the good news. And I wasn't interested in complaining or protesting. I had noticed that in many of the major photographic careers of workers that I admired, they had been recognized for their early work, initial work, Robert Frank, Americans, Larry, Tulsa, Cartier-Bresson, Decisive Moment, and that's what people remembered. Now, I was going to do a chapter called The Curse of the Early Work, because you're nothing without it, you're nothing with it. But then I just decided to call it The Early Work. So those of you in this little event will know the real secret behind that. However, I really think that the opportunity to actually ask oneself one's story. When Leo Castelli died, there was a memorial for him at the Museum of Modern Art. And Robert Rauschenberg got up and said, I have nothing to tell about Leo. His life has been told. And it's an interesting use of words to think of a life as having been told. How do we evaluate ourselves, and by what perspective, through what dimension do we assess our own value when nobody else is listening? It's just person to person. So I wrote this as a challenge to myself. It's a letter to me to see if, in fact, I could do it. And books have a way of gathering momentum, becoming what they are, announcing themselves, proclaiming themselves, arriving as something that all of a sudden, did I do that? Is that really me? Would I change it? Too late now. Do I like it? And what it is, I now accept it. And it functions in some ways as a form of perhaps self-acceptance. So I left a lot out there's nothing confessional whatsoever. Not interested in that. More interested in how my life unfolded and my aesthetics were formed and the creative process evolved and the people around me who enhanced my life. So, it's a long answer to somebody's question. Anything else you want to discuss? Is there a God? I don't know.
Something particularly juicy or interesting out of those leftovers?
Yes, quite a bit. Any other questions? Yeah, hi, Chris.
You've said it in the past, and I've asked you this a few times. I'm curious how you approach it today. You said something a few times that I think it was melody.
All right.
To music, what reality is to photography. Can you respond to that for a moment?
In the chapter on music, I state that. So you know that photography has an inherent characteristic relationship to reality, so-called reality. Every photograph that you make is essentially going to look like it was taken in what we call the real world. Now, you could make a photograph out of focus of this ceiling. It would be 100% photographic, but you wouldn't be able to read it. You wouldn't know what it was. I like to be right on the edge. I don't want to make abstract photographs. I like photographing the abstract within things, the subject. So I had been a guitar player since I was 13 and, learned some classical in the Navy and this and that, but I never really studied until my friend Brandon started tutoring me at about age 65 for 10 years or so. And I learned to read and theory and harmony and stuff. And it occurred to me that melody is to music as reality is to photography. You can have music without melody, but then you're moving into atonality, you're moving into sound, you're moving into texture, skronk, noise. We all know what I'm talking about. I dropped this line at Annie's house to Philip Glass. I said, Phil, what do you think of this? Reality is photography, what melody is to music. And he says, well, this answer is fabulous. He said, I could do without melody, but I always have to have harmony. You see, that's really where it's at, right? You can, as long as there's harmony, you have an infrastructure, you have an architecture, you have some kind of a formal parameter whereby the piece is constructed. Even in the most avant-garde improvisation, quite often they're moving around a series of chords or modes or something like that. So, as a musician, I'm constantly trying to see what is the relationship between my senses. We see and then we hear. And I've been reading this great philosopher, Jean-Luc Nancy, a French philosopher, who states that the vision, in fact, is non-continuous. You close your eyes and it goes away. But we have no eyelids on our ears. When I stop speaking, there's some white noise, there's some footsteps. Sound is always entering. We can focus on what we choose to hear or not hear, but we never stop. So sound is even more pervasive as a dimension within which we experience our entire living motion. So I'm trying to find the relationship between the two and have little moments where I think it's partially successful. You'll notice my answers are never really short. Yeah, Chris.
Known you for many, many years as a photographer. How come you never let us take your picture? I don't remember I have much pictures of you.
Oh, I mean, I have boxes of pictures of myself. It was very hard to choose which ones to put in the book. Yes. There's a funny thing though when you talk about pictures of yourself. Some mornings you get up there, you're in the bathroom shaving. Hey, there's the guy right there. That's who I am. But of course, there's never really a photographer around at that moment. But we all know that when you see yourself in the mirror, and it kind of conforms to your self-image. Dream on. Well, anyway, this is why I have a lot of sympathy for the professional portrait photographer. He or she tends to have a format. They'll set up a light box, they'll set up a light situation. I could name Annie Leibovitz has that green light, that thing that you see. Avedon had his seamless, 80% gray, pen, helmet. They all have a certain thing that they do so that if you commission them to do a portrait, you're at least going to get that. It's going to look, it might not look like you, but it'll look like one of their portraits, you know. My pictures, I take pictures of people and they just hate them, and then 5 years later says, you know, Ralph, that picture you did of me is really great, you know. We grow into them. So it's silly. I do that too. I've been painted a couple times, and that's really something else. When you've been painted, you see who you are and who you're not at the same time, and then eventually 10 years passes, you put on a few pounds, and there it is. So, anything else? Yeah, Dave.
Well, yeah, you were saying that sequence, temporal things, and so on were not what you wanted to do, having read the preface of that.
No, it was chronological.
It is. Oh, okay. Because I was going to ask the whole question, which drives a lot of the work that you do, is sequence, ordering, narrative, and how that flows. But I didn't want to put out a heavy-duty question.
Well, that's a good question. No, it's an interesting question, and anybody who would come to hear me talk would probably get that question, you know. Two things. One is that when you do an autobiography, what happens is you start at the beginning, but by the time I hit around 30, all of a sudden I had to start going back and forth. You see, as the time marched on, I was constantly referring back to earlier periods, which is when a friend of mine, an editor, Jack Stevens, came into the picture and helped sort that out. That probably the hardest thing to deal with for me was, how do I go back and forth in time and have it hold together in the book? Now, that's a different kind of sequencing than you're asking. I have a lot of photographs in the books that are 2-page spreads and little mini essays, what I call little mini essays, you know, 4 on a page. Small little profiles in the travel section or things like that. But the long sequence. See, when I showed this book to my publisher, he said the most interesting thing, he said, well, it's an autobiography, but it's also an art book at the same time. And so when we got around to, I had a larger version of the book. The book was 2 inches larger, but all it had was more white around it. The pictures were the same size in my original layout. And he pointed out 2 things. He said, at 13 and a half inches, nobody could hold it in their hands to read it. And so the pictures are the same size, but we just took away some of the white. And the other thing he said was, we have to find a way in our production, in our printing, in our choice of paper, our ink formulae, and things like that. We had to find a way that I could include some of the artifacts, the postcards, the letters, next to what we'll call one of my serious photographs. How do I put a snapshot next to a work and get them to resonate harmonically within the book? So because it's 400 pages, we had to have a slightly thinner sheet than I usually print my books on. You know, I usually have much heavier stock, but then again, the book would have been like that. He was willing to do anything I wanted, this publisher. I was so fortunate to have found Joe Haig at Henny. But the sequencing thing is always, it's always there, you know, chronological.
Did you, while doing the book, because I imagine in some ways it's a form of therapy, did you learn anything about yourself that you hadn't been totally aware of?
Yes, but I'm happy to say that I forgot. You know what? One of the things I've said years ago, in my photographs, I have always used my projects. I move from one project, one book, one sequence, one series to the next. I'm always examining the things that are most mysterious to me, that I'm most concerned with in my life. And I never get an answer to my questions, but I get an acceptable definition of the problem. So maybe, in answer to your question in all seriousness, you know, after I printed the book, I didn't look at it for 3 or 4 weeks. And I'm just starting to get a little understanding of what I made. I'm more interested in it as an object. The introspection took place when I was making it. But I did exorcise. Probably that's the term that I would, you know, I had a difficult time with my father, but writing about it, getting it off my chest officially, taking an actual position on it, put up or shut up, what do you really think? It lessened my load. It definitely lightened the burden of I see him now in a slightly different way, probably. And that's what you get. That's what you get when you, I suppose that would be considered the reward of doing something like this. You see, I have never not brought in a book. That's a huge thing in my life. If I'm going to start a book, I'm going to finish it. And by finish, I want, you know. And I could have made this one longer and thicker, one and the same. But I think it would have lost momentum. I think it would have become too obsessive, too neurotic or whiny. No whiny in this book, I hope. Get back to me.
Yeah.
And as sort of continuation to this question, like at which point you can consider like something complete, even in your career. When to stop and when not to become obsessive into changing and editing.
Well, you know, I had already started another body of work while I just photographs, another series of photographs. So I'm always 2 or 3 projects into something. I'll be 80 in January, and I wanted this book out for my 80th. But then I started to say, well, you don't have to have it out for your 80th. Well, you know, you get it out when you do. But I'm very happy when this opportunity came. I said, good, that's an omen, that's a good sign, do it, you know, so. Yeah, Annie.
I haven't seen the book yet, but you said you left a lot out and it's not conceptual. So would you say it's more like an autobiography or memoirs, or it's more of the same?
Yes. I'm not exactly sure. To be honest with you, the term hagiographic, you know, I also have an archive at the University of Arizona at the Center of Creative Photography. And I've had it since I was in my early 30s, and I only put into that archive what I want to put into that archive. I don't just put everything like some people do in their archive. It's what I want it to be, if you're going to do it. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to read between the lines in my book. But you know, I don't really, I'll be perfectly honest with you, and I'm not trying to be falsely humble or rude, but I'm amazed that anybody would read my book. I really am. I think that it's asking a lot. It's taking time out of somebody's life to, so I tried to make its essential value centered around the creative process. My photographic emphasis is really what drives the whole thing. But that's no longer in any way separated from my day-to-day quotidian real life. They're one and the same thing and have been for forever, you know, so. Yeah, Chris. Tony.
Thanks. I have a question. You know, many art forms in the first 20 or 30 years of their creative phase, they achieved their masterpieces. But yours seem to shifts from time to time.
I didn't pay him to say that.
But I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion of that statement itself about early creativity versus how it most of the time doesn't continue?
Well, when I came to New York in 1967, John Zarkowski was the seating director of photography at the Museum of Modern Art, and the modernist aesthetic was in full bloom, which meaning street shooting, objectivity, and not subjective stuff like mine in any way. So Zarkovsky said about this time in one of his books, he said that in the case of the major practitioners, they seem to have done their best work in a 7-year period. And as I'm writing that, I said, Zarkovsky stated that the major photographers did their best work, and I went on to say, you'll read it. Probably when he wrote that, he was sitting down. So I got that one out. You see, I think that you should get better and better as you go. There's going to be a difference. Obviously, my early work was romantic, it was poetic, it was less intellectual. But weren't we all more romantic and poetic in our 20s? You know, if I were pushing 80 and was still as romantic and as poetic, I think there's a word for that, and I think they put you in special places. You know, when you're so. You know, I'm more interested in in honing my intellectual prowess than, but a more serious answer to your question. I received my initial recognition with a book called The Somnambulist, 48 pictures about a dreams, which I stated were a dream sequence. While sleeping, the dreamer reappeared elsewhere, and this is what he saw. And I laid out the sequence of 48 pictures. And 3 months after it came out, I was recognized as an art photographer. Well, I took 36 of them or something in one weekend. And for want of a better way of explaining it, I know personally, I hold the view that when I was working directly from my creative source of inspiration, which I have subsequently through the years visited for shorter periods of time, but anyway, I know when I'm there. And this taught me something. It showed me that the great artists that we admire, Bach, Da Vinci, these huge geniuses that produce so much incredible work, the Picasso, they could go to that place 9 to 5. You see, they just went there. Why do some great artists produce so much more great work than other very good artists who produce much less? And obviously, if you're working as an artist, you need those endorphins that making a strong work provides. I do anyway. One of the things that drives me to continually work is if I don't put a new picture up on my studio wall on a regular basis, I'm not so fond of myself as otherwise. You know, I need to see myself reflected in those works. And so I hold the view that the great artists of history, of yore, were able to access their creative source on a regular basis, which was, many great artists have said that their greatest technique was their ability to inspire themselves. Here's some of my inspiration now. Laurie, darling. Thank you.
Hi, Ralph.
I'm so glad you're here. So now we can get a really interesting conversation going. Yes, say hi. Oh. Good. So you and I had agreed we were going to talk about creative process, and I would rather ask you about yours.
Okay. Well, Yep. Okay. I love this book. So, have you been signing books?
Yeah, I did.
Great. And how many of you have one for yourself?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Because it's I hadn't imagined it being so huge. I mean, there's quite a huge collection
well, I am
of
80.
things. It's a huge collection of things.
That will do it.
Huge. And the way it's laid out and how black and white and color are talking to each other is just amazing.
I really like that
really
in
love the way-
photography. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have the craziest. What is this one?
It's a little awning in Paris.
Beautiful.
It's a bit abstract.
Yeah. So you were under an awning and thought, yep, that's it.
Yeah. You know, cultures like France, total cultures are very photogenic. When you have a complete totality like that, it tends to stimulate one.
Deja Vu. This one. Oh,
Well, you know, when after the Somnambulist, I said, I'm not going to do Son of Somnambulist. I said, I wanted to do Deja Vu because it's one of those sensations. You have one, and you know, while you're registering that you had one, it's fading, right? So I thought there might be a photographic parallel to that.
oh, because of its fading photographic
Yeah,
quality.
so the speed of it.
That's actually norepinephrine. Deja Vu.
It is?
Yeah, you have a temporary shortage of geeky fact. The roughly the part of your brain that's experiencing things and the other half that's acknowledging that you just experienced things are connected by norepinephrine, and it fires across the from one part of the brain to another. When you have a little shortage of it, you do experience it as something from the past. And it was from the past, but it was not, another lifetime ago. It was 0.0001 seconds ago.
Oh my God!
So it still is the past because it's always processing it like that.
That is, that's kind of like photography.
It is,
in its
yeah.
shortness.
How many seconds was your lens open?
Right. It
That
occurred
is
to
the
me my whole career,
greatest.
maybe my camera lens has been open a minute. It's always a tiny little fraction of a second. Yeah.
How did you figure that out? How did you come up
Well,
with
it's somewhat
that?
hypothetical.
Okay. Gosh, I love sitting around with these books. And
There's a
this-
lot of good stuff here.
and this Mexican
yeah.
fiesta look that's on top of it. It's really wonderful.
Laurie told me once, remember when there was that ash over Sweden, 10 years ago, was it?
Or Iceland?
Yeah, over
Yeah,
Iceland.
mhm.
So you were stranded in London for
Yeah,
a week and you
yeah.
bought 70 books that week.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I always like that image,
Yeah,
70 books.
Yeah. Yeah, that was an exaggeration.
But you have just brought out, you just
Big
brought out
one.
your book, Things Lost in the Flood, which is about the same size. It's more of a raisonné, though, your book, right?
It's essays about pictures. What are pictures, and how do words relate to pictures? And these, can you talk a little bit about how you wrote about? Because it seems like often it's almost a diary fragment of when you were taking the shot, or a little bit about the country, or how did you decide to use words along?
Well,
with
that's a good question, because one of the things I did immediately, I was 30 when the Somnambulist came out, and I started being able to have enough money to travel. And I quickly discovered that traveling hits more of the senses than anything else you can do. New place, eyes, smell, mouth, ears, everything. So I tried to very much build that into my creative process. And I still find going someplace new, especially that first day, where I love being in a place where I don't speak the language and I can't read the signs, and I have to rely purely on my relationship to shape and light and color and things like that. Kind of that's essentially what I think about traveling. Now, in the case of a country like France, where I have many pages, L'Histoire de France, and I've been working since 1970, or Italia, those are bigger projects that have accrued through the years. Yeah.
But I always get the sense of, when I'm looking at your photographs, of this sense of shock, like you're saying, like you open your eyes and go, whoa, that's like seeing it for the first time sort of thing.
Well, of course, I like hearing that. What I am really thinking that produces that response, perhaps, is that, if you're making a drawing, you add marks until you've added all the marks and you stop, but it's essentially an additive process. When I take a photograph, I move in closer and closer till there's nothing in the frame except what I want in that frame. And that tends to emphasize what remains in a certain, perhaps heightened way. I mean, when it's successful, but I'm also interested in the idea of...
Is that why you chose this as a cover? Because it is kind of like getting... Wow, this is very...
That's Mary Jane in
closer
Sardinia.
And closer, yeah. There
She's
you
sitting
are.
right over there.
Yes.
My beautiful wife.
Yeah, getting closer and closer to... But you left everything else in, which is generous of you.
Well, I had wanted to, I had noticed when she was looking at herself in the mirror, I found it fascinating. And I wanted to, that was the initial point of departure into that picture. So we were in Sardinia on the beach, and I said, and she was doing something, I said, just hold that and let's work with that a bit. It's a picture like that is exactly a 50-50 collaboration, right? She had to participate, I had to participate. So. But it, perhaps as a cover, it functions. It goes in many directions, that picture, you know. So.
Yeah,
I was going to
have
call the book False Emotions.
Why?
I have no idea. Self-exposure is so much better. It's a good thing I didn't. But
yeah, I think false emotions is that's a tough one. But I think coming up with the title is congratulations that you did. You know, it's really
I know.
Just one. How many people here are photographers? Oh, okay. And titles are hard, right? They're just. How about writers? How many people are writers? Okay.
They start with a blank white page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This is why I made a software program once to get around that problem of the blank page, and I was working. I made a CD-ROM, and this was a program that you can start with. Instead of a blank page, you start with all of Crime and Punishment, and you carve it away. So it's a program that allows you to reassign your friends' names to the names in the Russian novel, and then your places, and then situations. And at the end, you have a very complicated book, and no one, I'm guaranteeing, will see that the template for that is Crime and Punishment. So, you know, there are lots of ways to work, and so like pulling it apart or adding it, you know, it's just the fear that is the worst part. No, like how can I add something to the world on this blank piece of paper? You know, there's so many things in the world. Why would I add something more? Do you feel that?
No, I'm a one-man band in my studio, just trying to knock myself out, and the rest of the time. But while you were talking, I was thinking that I've been fascinated with Cy Twombly, and when he puts all these in one of the books I was reading about him, he showed a poem, a Greek poem, where he would scratch out certain words, and just what remained, those were the words that he would put on his painting. Nice. And that's how he came up with some of these Aeschylus and things like that. And Roberta Smith recently wrote, Twombly is a pretty good painter, definitely, but he's also not a bad writer, which is interesting.
He's actually an excellent editor.
Yeah, very subtractive.
Yeah. I think it's, and then in putting the book together, did you try to be, what was your approach? I mean, because you're kind of coming in on subjects when you're looking through the lens, and then when you have to, did you put it together like you would a show, like you would an exhibition, or how?
That's a good question.
How would you?
You know, honestly, what I did was I just, as I mentioned earlier, I have a layout program InDesign on my computer, and I had a template left over from a previous book, and I made a text box and I started writing stories. And then when I was traveling or not in my studio, I might send myself an email, which I cut and paste into the thing. But I had no discipline or structure whatsoever. I just did it when I felt like it. But it wasn't too hard because I know the subject. Yeah. You know, I wasn't really digging for anything original. Yeah. You know, it was more a question of making something I knew very well look good.
But some of these are diary things, and I thought, like, how does he remember all of that stuff? I mean, are there real diaries, and you take them down off a shelf and transcribe them?
I have.
Diary in here.
I have diaries from from 22, 23 on, and I have them in boxes by years. And I've written them throughout my entire life. And when this project came along, I started looking at them, and there was nothing I could use. I mean,
really? Why? Too private, or what?
Because the problem was that I could never write with a pen. I'm very fond of my handwriting, by the way, as a brief aside. But I could never write fast enough to record my thoughts. And so when I was typing on the word processing program, then my speed of thought, I could get the words out at about the similar speed.
That's very important, to be in sync with your mind.
Yeah. That's the moral of that story for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
No, it's true, because if you're always having to like catch up to yourself,
Yeah, yeah.
it's one of the reasons I like to put pauses into, spoken things. It gives you a chance to think of where you're going. The headlong sort of stuff is much harder to do.
Well, this experience made me think, well, maybe I could really learn how to write. But then I realized that there's not much allegory in me. I'm a formalist. I'm not a storyteller, raconteur. Like a film director, can't wait to tell you about his next film and stuff like that.
I think you tell great stories. I mean, when you talk about where you've been and something that somebody told you, or a book you read, especially the one, Shadows? What's the Japanese book?
Oh, In Praise of Shadows?
Yeah.
That was a good one, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that book? Because you really had me when you were describing it, and how it influenced your work and what you thought about it,
Well, I was just with my friend Toby in my studio, and I have a special section of books that I keep at hand, and some of them I've had since the early '60s. You think things I lost in the flood. Well, if I had to grab, it was just two sections of one of those. But among the books that I continue to re-examine, Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, some of Marguerite Duras' early pieces. That In Praise of Shadows is very good because the imagery is so vivid and the words are so sparse. And they're not really koans or haikus, but they're just these little. I know the power of a word in the pen of a master, and I can recognize it. I can't evoke it myself, but.
But what about that book? Can you say one or two things about the Shadows?
Well, I remember this guy lived in the forest, and he had an outhouse and made out of very coarse wood, and he didn't separate the construction of this outhouse from the rest of the forest. And so the wood was one and the same. And he talked about, you know how when you go into a construction, you can smell wood, and sometimes you can smell old wood. Living in the city, we don't smell old wood very often. As a guitarist, I go to a luthier's
to smell old wood.
and he has wood around.
Yeah.
So when I think of that book now, that's what came to mind. The smell of wood in the forest.
I love this situation where it's almost camouflage, where one thing turns into another.
Mm-hmm.
The wood against the forest. And I was just a friend of mine just gave me a really good idea, which is to make a fake path in the back of my place. And because she said, when paths are so romantic, you think, oh, you could go wandering off into the forest, and I have just a forest that doesn't belong to me, but she said, just make a little path that ends about 20 feet into the forest, and then you could look at it and go, wouldn't it be so wonderful to walk into the deep forest?
So beguiling.
And all you have to do is really see it. So, I mean, it's like a photograph. You just see it, and then your imagination fills in everything else. I just was working on a project in Australia called Stories in the Dark, because I really wanted to work instead of with images, with mental images, because people have such amazing mental lives, and you just have to give one or two little cues, and people fill in the rest. It's like your dreams. You suddenly have an enormous visual world that's yours, and. So it was called Stories in the Dark, and they built a theater that was absolutely, totally black, not one little spray of light, and the ushers had night vision glasses, but they didn't work because you need a little tiny bit of light. So all we did was, there were stories, and then very big, very, very realistic, very loud sound effects. So the first thing that happens is a huge train comes in and fills the whole room and just stops like, and and suddenly everything, because you hear that, everything about your feelings about trains and about leaving and going are suddenly right there, and you're somewhere. And I think it strikes me that some of your photographs are really like that, because you have just a detail of one, and you let people, stroll around in Paris from that one detail. It evokes so many things, because you've chosen to just take one piece. But I think they work for me because I have associations that immediately rush in to fill all of the things around it, or a feeling around it. I never stay with the purity of that image. I'm like, oh, that's something he chose from this very complicated visual field, and he just said, look at this one tiny little thing. And that's where the emotion is in it, or that's where the feeling of how bright it was that day, or, just because it's the glint off a glass, and you fill in the rest of the day, and the rest of the country, and the rest of who else is there. So they're very story-like in that way, I feel, with your photographs,
Well, I love hearing your interpretation that way, because some of it had occurred to me and others hadn't, some of your observations. But while we're on the subject, I'm currently examining this idea that a photograph exists between presence and absence. That space between presence and absence. And I'm going to use that as a point of departure into another series of, with a thought like that, I will look in a different way, perhaps, So there's always been this thing about photography's relationship to so-called time and things like that, but that led me to believe that we all think that the future is permanent. And I'm not sure about it. T.S. Eliot says time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future. That would suggest that he too thought that the future was permanent. So what happens is your interpretation is kind of the result of this approach. This kind of an approach results in that kind of image, which is always, I believe that the art is always better than the artist. The photograph is always better than the photographer. Otherwise, why do it? And but I can say that when I was in art school in 1960, I had a camera that would only focus down to 3 feet, and I kept wanting to get closer to the subject. So, it's an impulse that is just clearly followable throughout my entire.
It's funny how your tools create your style. I think that sometimes it's. I remember in the mid-'90s there were a lot of tech companies that were asking artists to do things with their products, because they were basically, kind of, some were types of ways of getting images, some were sounds, but they didn't really have anything to do with them. They didn't know what to do with this stuff, so they needed artists to work with them, and they called us, I remember this was the worst term, content providers. We were supposed to be the content providers, and you're like, oh yeah, well, let me just come and pour a little content into your vessel, and then it'll really mean something. And every artist knows that if you cannot pull the form and the content apart, or if you can, that it's probably not made that well. It's just we're not writing philosophy. We're working with sound and image and things, and so the fact that they would contain some kind of message, they're very poor message carriers, really, because they involve our senses, and they go through they go through our eyes and our ears, and that gives them a completely different meaning. I mean, you can, for example, you see a book you see a word on a page, and it just says Live. And then you hear someone say, live. It's different. I mean, we live in a world of signs and symbols, and artists translate that into sensual things. I mean, that's what we do, and those sensual things give it the meaning that it has. So I think it's anyway. Also, I think in the sense of trying to put meaning into work sometimes, and back to this idea of how your camera influenced you to get closer. I think your tools and whatever you do really teach you things, so that sometimes I know that, especially, you know, when I try to put meaning into something or make an object mean something, you know, it just resists often. And if you don't understand how it works, how a camera works or how your tool works, it will be in pieces on the floor. You will just try to force it to mean something, force it to do something, instead of just play. And the playfulness of so many of your images is just so delightful, because you're going, that is just something that he passed by and went, yes, that, you know. And
What do you think is the equivalent in music of this close-up thing we're talking about?
maybe some parts of improv, when people get very, very deep into the intricacy of, and I'm just saying improv because it's immediate nature, that you don't write the score and then play it, but you're really just responding to it at that second. So maybe that, or I mean, many things you could say.
I mean, I was thinking volume, but perhaps in some cases it would be an example, but not always. Do you see? Now, you also spend a lot of time drawing, and you make videos as well. But what do you think, in terms of your living experience, is the relationship between sight and sound in your own work?
Well, I'd have to say that it's emotional, and that, I'm probably very typical of many people, that you very rarely go into a museum and see someone crying in front of their favorite painting. You might see that, but play your favorite piece of music. It's like it's wired right directly into your heart, and it can also make you dance. Very few people in museums are dancing when they're looking at paintings. Some are, but it's just, but not really. It goes into your eyes, to a different part of your brain, and it's a very more analytical part. But I think it has to do also with focus. That it's easier for you to kind of go out of focus with your eyes, because they're always scanning things, and then you have to almost force yourself to focus on something. And with your ears, I know it's the same. You're walking through the world, but we don't have like things that can, hone in on. I wish we could move our ears, and have them, and close our ears too. That would be really nice sometimes too. Just flap them closed, just. But we can't. So we're so vulnerable to that. So I think it's vulnerability of hearing and the emotional ties, so that of crying and movement and dancing. And I'm not saying that's. It's just a different limbic system that you're tuning into when you're doing imagery and music. And of course, when you're doing both, you've got a whole another crazy way of how do those things work, because then you have to sometimes choose which you're going to do. Look or listen a little bit more when it's a situation like that, and that's something that we're very good at, because we're always multitasking and using our eyes and ears to judge. Let's say somebody's talking to you, and they're going, "That is the nicest sweater," and you're not. That person hates my sweater. So you have to decide whether you're going to believe your eyes or your ears, and so what would be, and we're doing that all the time, which is dominating in that situation, and you're kind of. so we do that in terms of seeing things as well, like which
I
one.
mean, I'm just trying to refine my sensibilities, I think. You know, I mean, I try to write music, compose music, and so I know that I have to try to hear what I've made. You know, it's really,
it's
and
tricky.
I mean, you know, I record little slugs in Logic, and I just came across some that I hated when I made them 5-6 years ago that actually sound kind of interesting to me now, and I'm wondering why I didn't get it. What was wrong with my perception of them 5 or 6 years ago?
Good question. I mean, I just did a few months ago a 5 days of recording in for some reason in Copenhagen with Brian Eno, and we were asked by the library in Copenhagen to come and noodle around in a studio for 5 days. I don't know why. I wish we would do that in the United States, you know, just have these like very weird commissions of like, why doesn't a library commission 2 composers to sit? They just don't. It would never occur to us to do something like that. Anyway, fortunately, we were asked to do that. And what we did in these 5 days was very weird. We would play for 4 hours in the morning, but then we would have lunch, and then we would sit and listen to the same 4 hours. And I thought, this is going to be torture. But I realized I don't know how to play and listen at the same time. I thought I did. I don't. And also when you listen with someone through someone else's ears, it's, and also Brian is somebody who is listening in a way that's like, he'll suddenly go, that's fantastic. You know, he's really enthusiastic. You know,
That's a great thing.
Yeah.
Play and listen. John, can you play and listen at the same time when you play? Do you?
You're on the spot, John.
I know, it's amazing. Yeah.
I guess also when you're just noodling, it's a different thing, because if you're playing something that you know and you're listening to your performance aspects as opposed to the compositional thing, it's a very different experience. So
I mean, I read somewhere that and I hold the view that the primary musical experience is playing the music. The secondary experience would be to hear live music performed in front of you. And the third, the tertiary experience would be to listen to recorded music. You know, so I mean, for example, where you have noise or scrunk, improvised things, it's a lot of fun for the people sitting up there doing it. Sometimes it's a little difficult for those of us in the audience.
very, very true.
You know what I'm getting at. But
yeah, I've seen those faces like,
yeah. I mean, some composer, Varese, said to Feldman, when you're playing, listen to yourself from the middle of the auditorium. You've heard that idea, right?
yeah.
It'd be nice if you could do it, if you could project yourself in that way.
Yeah, it would. But I also, I mean, I edit by looking at people. I mean, people in audiences think they're invisible. You probably think you're invisible. I'm looking at all, I have a pretty great view of all of you.
Yeah.
And I can see when some of you are like, oh, God, they're rolling your eyes, you know? And
Yeah, I can tell when somebody's yawning in the back row, right?
We better change our topic,
Yeah.
change the tack.
Yeah.
Because it's very reliable, you know. People in unguarded things are reliable. You don't have to look a certain way. You're just kind of considering, and
Well,
I've done a lot of editing of shows that way.
I asked Leonard Cohen, I said, how do you play in front of 80,000 people? He said, well, you just pick the prettiest girl in the third row, and you just play the whole concert to her.
Leonard, the prettiest girl.
That's what he said.
Oh.
All right.
Did you read his book Flame? It just came out.
No, I didn't.
It just came out, and you know, it's like I just also got a giant block of like 80 vinyl things of David Bowie. It doesn't, just because you're dead doesn't mean that you can't release records or put out books.
Mm-hmm.
So Flame has just come out, and it's Leonard's drawings and poems and things from his last few months, and he worked really hard on that. and wouldn't take phone calls. And he said, "I've got to finish my book. I've got to finish my book."
Wow,
It was
I wanna
such
see
a
that.
yeah. It's probably right in the bookstore. You can go and get it right now. Flame. It's called Flame.
Does anybody have any questions for either of us? Yeah.
I'll bring you the mic.
I have an observation, just a thought that occurred to me as a photographer, and I'm guessing there's quite a few of us here, that you were talking about creating the music is primary, listening to it live is secondary. And I was thinking that as a photographer, I get such a great kick in that moment in the solar plexus, and you know it, I'm sure, then other photographers know it when you know you got the picture. This is the greatest moment. Then making the print is okay. Looking at the original print is quite fine if it's a fine print. And then looking at a printed page would come third, I'm thinking. So it's just occurred to me. I wanted to share it. I don't know if anyone would concur.
Yeah, I think that initial thrill is it. When you see it, when you get the idea, it's just, it wasn't there, and now it's there. I mean, it's a very godlike thing to take a photograph or to be an artist or to make something, that to really literally create it. So it's really, and I find that also, I've just been thinking about this, maybe because I read this Michael Pollan book of How to Change Your Life. And in it, one of the things he says, which I've been thinking about the last couple of days, is look at kids and you realize that they're all tripping. They're completely tripping. They're going, "Oh my God, a light!" And they just run towards it, and something's zooming in. Something's getting bigger and bigger. And I don't know why, because it's got, and wow, So, and then we kind of gradually keep losing that. We explain why things are getting bigger because they're getting closer, and because all sorts of other phenomena that suddenly have a reason to explain all of these crazy things that are happening. But I think that excitement of seeing things feeling like you're seeing it for the first time, or just discovering it and just capturing it, is the one that is like, that's the thrill. That's the thrill. That's why I'm in this, for that thrill.
Endorphins.
Yeah. That is a thrill. Yeah.
Brandon.
Ralph, you when you were talking about when you were taking the photographs for the Somnambulist, you made a gesture to the top of your head. It was very brief, but you made this gesture at the top of your head to indicate something about that space that you were in.
Sure. It was
that you spoke about some of the great artists that we know, and that how they perhaps spend more of the time there. That's one part of my question, if you would comment on a little more about that. And the other part is about earlier this year, some of us know that you were awarded the Medal of Le Chevalier in the Legion of Honor in France. And has that influenced your direction for future work in any way?
Well, obviously, that decoration released a lot of creative energy, and it came at a point in my career that it felt very good. I probably wouldn't have had the same reaction if I had got it 20 years ago. But one of the things is that because Laurie has arts and letters also of France, and it's such a rich culture that for such a rich culture to acknowledge something you've done tends to enhance its reward factor. So it's also made me realize I had thought that I was going to Europe through all the 80s and 90s, mostly to France, and I was thinking, there's a lot of other places in the world I might have gone to. Instead of going 4 or 5 times a year, just go 2 or 3 times a year, go someplace else. But now I'm very happy that I did, and one forthcoming project will be a really big tome entitled L'Histoire de France, where I will definitely say everything I feel for France, and I'll enlist some of their great philosophers and to contribute and stuff like that. So. Give it. I need a little support. Yeah. So anyway, endorsement. So, but as far as I'd mentioned earlier that when I made my first breakthrough book, I did most of it in a weekend. And I was at my source that weekend, and it was the first time I
There's
even
that
knew
gesture
it
again.
existed. Yeah, it's still up there, I guess.
Good
No,
call
I think
on that.
no. Back in those days, I had a lot of hair.
Oh, he's brushing his hair.
Yeah, yeah.
That's funny.
But that's that source thing. You see, I believe that when some guy my age in Wall Street is coming up with a derivative, I think he or she is coming from the same place in the human spirit where all creativity is born. It's how the results are analyzed afterwards that makes a difference. But I think that anything a human being creates comes from that place within the human spirit. And I think that, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the Picassos and Bachs and people, they were able to get there on a regular basis. It seemed to be part of their technique to go just straight to that place. And it's haunted me all my life, basically. That's essentially what I wrote mostly about in my journals, how I made a picture or what led to what led to what.
But what has haunted you exactly when you say that? I didn't quite get that.
Well, you know, when you have a period where you do so much very strong work, as opposed to other periods where it's coming very slowly and difficultly. The Somnambulist was a 48-page book, which brought me my recognition. 36 of those pages I made in 3 days. And then I spent basically 3 years doing the remaining 12 pages, you see, which was more of a normal rate of production. So this told me that many of the artists that I admired so much, had studied historically, were able to access that. I read Bergman on Bergman during this period. He had just made Persona, and he stated that while making Persona, his 26th film, he was 50 years old, an international master, he said he realized for the first time the creative potential of his own ambivalence. That got me through a very cold winter. So I was able then to consider my ambivalence as a positive rather than a negative component, which would then mean that I'd like more photographs better, you know, or acknowledge them as part of process.
That's a wonderful insight to see ambivalence as a subject.
Yeah.
And the other thing I had forgotten to mention about being in the studio with Brian Eno was that he absolutely loves failure. If there's something that just isn't working, he's delighted. He just, because it gives him a chance to rethink it or redo it, you know, and not just do the same old thing that he knows how to do, but it just didn't work, and now what do you do? So, yeah, and so failure is also a really wonderful topic. And
that's fabulous.
Yeah, I think the kind of sharpness and clarity of ideas sometimes just feels a little too brittle, you know, a little too, you know, easily earned, you know, and that the world has so much cloudiness in it and so much edges that are turning from one thing into another, and just as you touch it, it turns into another thing, and you realize that's actually the action, rather than trying to identify that thing or that thing. It's the turning, you know. So.
I mean, I write in here that artists learn from their failures. Yeah. The failures are more valuable than your successes. You know, what do you learn from your successes other than how great you are? No, that's not what you want. But that's not true of brain surgeons or bridge builders or something like that. They don't learn much from their failures. They're pretty quickly out of business.
I have a question all the way in the back.
There's
and then we'll
somebody in the
more.
back there. Yeah, I see a hand. Go ahead.
You were talking earlier about John Sarkovsky and when you started out in the 60s, and even that was still at a time when there was a ongoing debate about whether photography was even an art form. And I'm wondering whether now in the age of Instagram, the role of photography and its acceptance by culture and its pervasion into culture has changed so radically. I'm wondering whether if you were to start out now, not technologically, but in terms of your own sensibility, if it would be a totally different journey, because
It's a complex question. It's a great question. I did a TED Talk about how visual literacy has ascended because of iPhones and things like that. However, the theory was that the same software that made everybody a photographer made everybody's photographs look the same. The software is very pragmatic, dogmatic in that way. I will say that I go on various blogs that subscribe to every morning. L'Oeil de la Photo is one, and a few others. I see what's going on, what young people are doing today, and if any of them had been around in 1970, they'd have major careers today, because our visual excellence has massively increased. I think sophistication is the term I really should use. I think people are much more visually literate than they were before.
And also, I mean, the number of artists is staggering. I mean, I'm somebody who was down in Soho in the 70s and with one gallery and one restaurant and
Sure.
food restaurant and Ivan Karp gallery even before
Ivan.
Paula Cooper. So and then of course exponentially there were maybe like 70 artists. And you kind of knew all of them, and they were all living within about 6 blocks. Mm-hmm. And that was it. That was the art scene. And now, I mean, with the number of people graduating from a single art school, that's 3 times the entire artistic, community of Soho at that time.
I mean, the question is, are they being absorbed because it's a bigger population?
Well, I think they're doing other things. I think it's really improved a lot of other people who leave art school, or sometimes it's pretty daunting to get into that scene. So there are many other scenes to work in, and I think it's made the visual life of the country much wilder and richer. That a lot of artists are making that, in terms of graphics, in terms of all sorts of levels of design. It's artists trained in art schools who are contributing that to, and the whole country looks a lot better. It's much more interesting to look at in terms of the layout in magazines and furniture design, and these are things that didn't used to look so beautiful because they're made by
Sure.
artists now.
I mean, I have no doubt that cinema is probably, of all the visual arts, the most influenced by current technology. I think the next Citizen Kane is going to be shot on an iPhone big time. I have no doubt about that. Mm-hmm. I saw that one Unsane that Steven Soderbergh made on the iPhone. It pretty much looked like it was shot on an iPhone. It wasn't that great, but I like the idea that because of our delivery systems, I'm big on that notion of delivery systems where you look on your laptop. I was telling a friend that a director told us that he's doing a film, and he said he can't get a crew because everybody's working on Netflix and all these series. So you could easily opine that our visual dynamic is massively enhanced at this time. In answer to be a young artist at this time, it's always difficult to be a successful artist since the Lascaux Caves, So I guess that even today, I once in a while I'm just knocked out by something I see. There's a Chinese photographer, Ren Hang, who I can't believe how creative he was, He died in his late 20s, but it's still happening. I can't keep up with Chelsea and Brooklyn and the art world. We went last Sunday to Beacon Dia, and that was Old Home Week. All those people you were saying from Soho back in the day, Sarah, Walter de Maria, Smithson, Chamberlain, all those types were there. So,
yeah, it's an utterly different world now.
I really like it for that reason.
Yeah.
I don't have any nostalgia for. I don't want to give up my iPhone. I have a nostalgia for the future. It's the last sentence in my book. I hope to be around to see a lot more of this going on, because I think I think ultimately we might see a content that we have never seen before. Great art has always delivered us something that we had previously not known about.
I'm looking forward to interspecies art.
Interspecies art?
Yeah, I mean to understand other creatures and make art for them and understand their art forms.
Concept, yeah.
Yeah, there's.
Have you seen any, by the way?
I've made some.
You mean
interspecies.
Lullabelle or something?
No, music for dogs.
Music for dogs
Yes.
is interspecies.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, yeah, that's
And
true.
and it's some of the most exciting things I've been involved in. I really love trying to make contact with another type of mind, because the art mind is one that is generating objects in new styles and new colors and new kind of, maybe ways to look at things, but jump out of your mind and to another type of mind, and it could be very, very interesting. I mean, I just got into that because it actually started with talking to young artists at RISD, and I was doing a commencement speech there. So I was, my job was to talk to congratulate all these young artists and tell them how easy it was going to be to get a job in the art world, and how their student debt would be wiped out in any minute, and I'm sitting there wearing the mortarboard and the robe, and it was really hot, and I'm feeling like a total fraud, just trying to convince the parents that they just spent $179,000 a semester on it. It was all for the, good cause of getting their child into the photography world or the whatever. And I was just thinking, oh my God, what am I doing here? And I was, because I was like in a daze because it was too hot, I was sitting next to Yo-Yo Ma, and he was going to be talking or playing in the thing as well. And I said, but sometimes when I'm playing a concert, I look out and I imagine that the whole audience is dogs. And he said, I have that fantasy too. And I said, you do? I said, okay, the first person who gets to do that has to invite the other one. So I got the opportunity to do that in Sydney. I was asked to curate a big festival called Lives in the Opera House there, and lots of different venues in Sydney. So I got to invite all my favorite playwrights and musicians and writers and poets and photographers and filmmakers, and it was wild. And so when I was talking to the promoter of the festival, I said, and I'm also going to do a concert for dogs. And he didn't say concert for dogs. No, he just writes down concert for dogs. And I was like, you know what that is? Anyway, so we did this concert, and it was short. It was 20 minutes long, because attention span. But it was in the steps of the Sydney Opera House. That's the one with the big sails right on the harbor, and it has a flight of steps that's just magnificent. And we thought a few hundred dogs would come. Thousands of dogs showed up, thousands, and they immediately overflowed our three areas of little, medium, and big onto the steps, and they were like all there. And so we started, and it began with an invocation for whales, so in their frequencies, because the whales are right there in the harbor. And because why do animals sing? To find each other. Whales in the ocean, dogs establish their GPS. Says, I'm over here, I'm 2 miles over here, I'm back in your backyard. I mean, that's what they do. That's why they sing to each other and talk and bark. So anyway, it was a small ensemble playing for these dogs without the very low-end things which make dogs nervous. Sounds like thunder or bombs, so those were edited out, as well as the high-frequency things that makes things nervous, dogs nervous. But anyway, I have to say that there are a lot of Australian dogs who just want to rock. Want to rock. And they were there and they didn't know what they were doing there because, it wasn't a dog run. And who knows why you're at a concert anyway? Your friend told you, you just got to come to we don't know why we go in either. We're just there. And so they're there, and we're playing the music for them. I'm like, okay, I'm going into another realm here, and I'm just looking at all the dogs, and watching them listen to this because they're exquisite listeners. Exquisite. Those of you who have dogs and cats know that we have a lot in common with them in terms of hearing. And my favorite were the droolers, and they were in the front row, and they were just like. Just listening, and it was one of the best experiences of my life because at the end they were also polite, and they had all the vets Australian vets had lined this whole thing with their trucks because they were afraid there was going to be some dog fight or whatever, and there wasn't because, as I said, they didn't know what they were doing there. So at the end I said, okay, let's just make some noise. I mean, it's just like so quiet. So I said, little dogs, get all the little dogs, and okay, medium, come on, join in, and then big ones, and for 5 minutes, they barked and howled, and I thought I was gonna die from happiness. I mean, it was just like the most beautiful sound you've ever heard because they were just barking because they could. And because it was suddenly the thing to do. And it was very, very loud and very, very beautiful. And so I thought, well, what if we could start making things that would break out of our own set of what we think art is or what we think music is or what we think we're doing here anyway. What are we doing here anyway? What are we making this for? So my answer sounds really shallow, but it's for fun. It's really for fun to see what you can make. And so anyway, when I think of the future, it's dreary for me to think of more technology. I'm very involved in tech stuff. Whenever I'm doing a lot of VR these days, and so whenever I go to a film festival, for example, where we have VR installed, it's really deeply snobby. We refer to the other works in the festival as flat films.
Oh, flat film.
Flat films. That's the flat film. I mean,
Okay.
we don't really mean that, of course, because many of the greatest treasures of human creation are in the earliest black and white films, and not to mention the entire history and all of the energy that goes into making films. But I think that it's easier to get carried away with the technology than it is with the reason of why we're making these things.
But that technology is a product of our systems today. And one of the things I'm trying to get my head around, which I thought of while you were speaking, is what is the Marxist position on artificial intelligence or virtual reality? Seriously, I've been reading the Communist Manifesto, and I can't seem to get it to apply to what's really happening now. And I love technology too. I think it's just the greatest thing. After 60 years in the wet darkroom, I'm really enjoying working digitally. I can assure you of that. So.
Well, that's the operative word, is work, because of course that work was written in mid-19th century, and when people just were beginning to wonder what work was, and it starts off the manifesto: "A specter is haunting Europe," as if that is not like right now, and ends with "Workers of the world unite," as if that weren't right now. At the same time that manifesto is being written, another incredible work about work was written, which was Bartleby the Scrivener, Melville's work, which is about, those of you who know, a guy who works on Wall Street, and he's basically an accountant, and he's just a drudge. He's just doing the same thing all the time, and he's like really fed up with it. And he's like, I can't stand it. And he just, finally his boss says, Bartleby, you're slowing down. And he just, you don't want to work? And he says, I prefer not to. Now that sentences came ringing down the 19th century, in parallel to the Communist Manifesto, which is another thing about what we're doing. We, in the visual world, call it work. Musicians call it, I'm going to go and play somewhere. So I think that the work ethic in terms of how it's entered the art world tends to be, you would never, I don't think musicians would say, come and hear my new work. They would give it a title, but visual artists can easily say, the title of my new exhibition is My New Work. And you're like, that's vague, but because work is such a kind of marker of how you go through your career in it, that it is then considered.
Yeah, but when I'm not working, that's the painful part.
Exactly.
That the downtime is not the good time.
But you play music in your downtime.
Sure, there's always something going on.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. I like the musicians play. I have another thing that I'm considering as a passionate musician also. I never put myself on the line. I make my living as an artist photographer, but I never put myself on the line with my music that I'm going to make a living from that. And I also know a lot of passionate, very advanced amateur photographers who made good livings and doing something else. So there is that aspect too of where you say, I'm going to profess this, I think is the term, right?
Got time for one last question in the back here.
Cecilia? Oh.
Thanks. Mr. Gibson, you said earlier that the eyes have eyelids, but the ears don't have earlids.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that because when you close your eyes, and I think Laurie Anderson referred to this, you actually don't stop seeing. You see internally. And I'm just wondering about the tension between the internal world, if you take a photographer like Cindy Sherman or Man Ray even, or some of your work versus photojournalism, which is absolute reality. How do you strike that balance? Where do you see internal reality?
A current thought. I've been reading Theodore Adorno, who said, to think is to identify. We all know we think in words, and words are essentially identifications and they're essentially images. It's very hard to think of nothing, if not totally impossible. I took a picture recently off the highway. It said, signal ahead. Well, what was this? Sign, signifier, signified, etc. I think what happens is we tend to determine how we're going to process our perceptions according to our individual matrix of needs at any given instant. Because I will work on a series of photographs for 3 or 4 or 5 years. I will alter my answer to your question at different phases throughout the production of winding up with a book or a series or an exhibition or something. But I love all these things that have to do with the nature of our perceptions. There's this Greek term, solipsism. How we feel determines how we perceive reality. Therefore, the only thing that's real is how we feel. Well, that's great if you're an artist in studio. It's not so good, again, if you're a brain surgeon or a bridge builder. But as a full-time solipsist, I can answer your question one way now and another way in a couple hours.
Did you ever take a picture of nothing?
Well, one time, in my early days in New York, I was sitting over with some friends on 9th Avenue, totally stoned, listening to Coltrane, and somebody says, well, man, let's take a picture. And nothing, you know. So and we'll meet tomorrow, the next day, and we'll show you what we got. And I went out, and I took a picture of the sky. No clouds. But it was completely recognizable as this guy. It was just a gray rectangle. I won the contest. I'm very proud of that story. It's in the book. So the answer is yes.
Congratulations.
Nothing, but you could tell what it was.
I've seen that in Nothing before.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you all for your questions, and thank you so much for Laurie. Thank you, Laurie.